Hello and welcome to this broadcast by Brexit Watch. I'm your host, Jonathan Saxty. Today we are delighted to welcome macroeconomist Professor Patrick Minford to Brexit Watch. Patrick Minford is Professor of Applied Economics at Cardiff Business School. A noted Eurosceptic, he is the chairman of Economists for Free Trade, formerly Economists for Brexit. Professor Minford, welcome to Brexit Watch.
Good morning. Thank you.
Now, Patrick, before we get into the meat of our discussion, as I always do, I like to wish you and your family well during this coronavirus crisis. Can I begin by asking how the crisis has personally impacted you and your work over the last few months?
Well, I think like everybody, I've been pretty fed up with being locked down, being in a so-called vulnerable group. So this has been quite, psychologically depressing, sort of being unable to go into work and see one's colleagues and so forth. I think from a sort of practical work point of view, I mostly do my work online anyway, with emails and writing papers and talking to colleagues, sending them drafts and so forth, and also talking to my students. At the moment, because the main bunch of students on the master's programs are doing exams, it's PhD students, and those are almost all online discussions anyway. So in a practical way, it hasn't made that much difference. It's been more psychological, I think, like for everybody else.
Now, sticking with the crisis, Patrick, what has been your assessment so far of how the government have handled things, especially on the economic side?
Well, I think one has to remember that this is a very emotive subject for everybody, and a lot of what the government has done has been led by public reactions to this COVID-19 virus deaths. This has of course made people extremely upset and worried for themselves and for their relatives, and so I think it has been the main driver really of what the government has done. I mean, I think people say, well, the government panicked. I think the government panicked the same way as everybody else panicked when it seemed like the deaths were rising really fast. And then, of course, the virologists at Imperial fed the flame, so to speak, with this hugely alarmist projection of how many people might die if nothing was done. I think that was a wrong projection myself. From the work we've done, it looks wrong. But on the other hand, it fed into the general panic at the time that deaths were rising fast and people were very worried. So I think the government really reacted to public opinion as much as anything else. And so what it did was sort of understandable. I think it would have taken an enormously difficult step if it had kind of resisted the general feeling something had to be done to stop the virus raging as it was at that time. And, the Swedish approach was, of course, quite different. They managed to keep very calm in the face of the same sort of thing going on. And it was interesting to see how they succeeded in holding their nerve and keeping going through that. And we've done some comparisons of what's happened in Sweden and what's happened here. And actually, it looks like the Swedes have done pretty well by following orthodox public health policies, probably better than ours, really, in terms of how they handled care homes and the NHS, and sort of stopped their National Health Service sending patients that were effectively infected to care homes. A lot of that sort of thing that Sweden got better than us has seemed to have stood them in good stead. And the fact that they didn't do a lockdown seems to have meant that they're still doing pretty well.
It's interesting to speak about Sweden. More broadly, how would you compare and contrast the UK response to the response in continental Europe, the US, and the Asia Pacific region?
Well, they've all been very different, really. I mean, in the Asia Pacific, you've had countries like Singapore that have had already prepared themselves because of SARS and had got strategies in place to test, trace, and isolate, which were well implemented with lots of foresight. And worked extremely well. Of course, there and more or less the same sort of thing was done in in South Korea. So it shows, and South Korea, of course, a very much bigger place than Singapore. So it shows these things can be done, but they take an awful lot of organization, and we just did not have that organization in place. So when we tried to do test, track, and isolate, it just didn't really get done very well. And so it very rapidly became clear that people were getting infected very quickly. And of course, we know that in the early stages, this COVID virus moves very fast. And of course, they all knew that because they'd got their sights trained on SARS, having had that pretty badly some time ago. So, I think they were better prepared. And as for other countries in Europe, I mean, as we know, Italy was completely unprepared, really, and let it get overwhelmed their health service. Sorry, I'm getting feedback here. I don't know why.
No problem at my end.
Oh dear. I'll carry on anyway. You can edit out that bit.
No problem.
Well, going to the continent, as we've seen, Italy was far more unprepared than we were, really, and so things move very rapidly there, and because they're very integrated society, with the old living with the young, it hit them very hard, with households, old people getting it very badly and dying in large numbers. So really, experience has been very different all over the world. And of course, the US is an example of a place which had very mixed approaches in different states. And the federal government didn't do an awful lot, really, at the end of the day. It was mostly done by the states, which were all very different. So we've got a huge amount of experience there to kind of inform our policies as we move forward.
Now, we've heard in the last day or so that shops are going to start to reopen next month. Of course, there's concern that consumers may not return to their normal patterns of behavior. This is something we've seen in Germany. It's also something we've seen in Italy. And of course, once leisure and hospitality establishments start to reopen, many will find it very difficult to trade with social distancing in place. I mean, I've made the point in one of my articles, it will be almost impossible to enforce social distancing in a bar in Mallorca, and you can apply that to a pub in central London. What do you see as some of the long-term, possibly medium-term impacts on the economic side from the lockdown, both domestically and more widely?
Well, the lockdown, one has to remember, is also following public opinion. And really what you're saying is exactly right. The people are still pretty nervous and won't necessarily go back to their old ways of socializing very quickly. A lot of these things depend on sentiment, and I think a lot will depend on how rapidly the deaths come down. I mean, we're projecting that the deaths will come down quite fast now. They're already round about the 100 mark, and we think by the early part of July they're going to be down to single figures, or double digits at most. And I think that people will start to calm down as that happens. Because we live with death the whole time, of course. It's obviously the case. It's so, we know that it's pretty dangerous to go on the roads, and we will know that. Sorry, I'm getting feedback again. I don't know why. I don't know why this is happening. I'll try reconnecting it. It's my. Maybe I'll take these out actually, because I can hear you. I can hear you. I can hear you through my loudspeakers, I think.
I can hear the feedback now myself as well. Yeah. What we might do,
It's annoying, this feedback. We might have to reconnect or something.
but I tell you what we can do.
It doesn't happen.
Is it still happening now?
No, it's not. It's all right now.
Okay, we're still recording. That bit can be edited out. So let's keep going. I'll
Yes,
move on.
it's all right. I can keep going. Yes. So the essential point is about sentiment, that a lot will depend on how the death rate moves. I mean, once the deaths are kind of down to very, very low numbers, or even none at all, as will gradually happen because this virus is going through this logistic curve process whereby it's now kind of infected everybody it can infect, pretty much, or rather it's infected all the people it can easily infect, and so the rate slows down, and then the deaths will fall naturally. And as that happens, I think people will calm down, and that will lead, I think, during July to a much more positive approach, really, in terms of handling risk at the personal level. And people will say, oh, well, goodness me, I do drive, and that's pretty risky. So I'm going to go into the streets, and, that's risky too, but I can handle it. So I think it will be an important economic factor, a bit like all these things that, we live with. I mean, the flu kills a lot of people. A lot of things kill people, but we still go about our business. And I think that will gradually become the norm again. I mean, I'm noticing already that people in parks are much more calmer than they used to be. And they're going to parks and thinking, well, what the hell, I've got to have a bit of fresh air. And so people will, I think, get back to normal more quickly than is feared at the moment.
Now, of course, the world economy is an interconnected spider's web. I mean, we've heard in Britain that New Zealand, one example of a country that seems to have sort of overcome the crisis to a large degree. But of course, for a country like New Zealand, unless and until their major trading partners come back online, as it were, their economy will not be running at full pelt. It will be in second gear. What do you see as some of the wider international implications on the economic side from the lockdown?
Well, I think you're seeing more and more countries come on stream now, and that will help international trade. And, because of the linkages you're talking about, so that, well, China has already come back largely on stream and is dealing with its problems in the sort of, as Boris Johnson calls it, whack-a-mole way. And I think more and more countries are going to, particularly as the deaths come down, which is what I was saying earlier in the UK, will kind of go back to normal, but will have the whack-a-mole mentality that they will try to use means of spotting outbreaks in hotspots and dealing with them individually. And so I think that will underpin a gradual going back to normal in the world economy. And so obviously these things don't happen overnight, but they can happen more quickly than people think, because this is a physical thing. It's not as if suddenly people lost confidence for no reason. Actually, what happened was something physical attacked them, and their governments and they reacted by stopping doing things. And once it stopped attacking them, they'll go back to their other behavior, because that's the sort of, it's a response to a physical thing once it's moved away. If you go back to earlier pandemics and so forth, this was the pattern before. Of course, you get these second wave things, but we know from viruses that their survival depends on milder, not killing people. So if they kill a lot of people, that reduces the susceptibility of the population, and those strains tend to go out because they die. They're less successful. So the strains of these viruses that are successful are the ones that don't kill so many people. And so I think there's optimism ahead for the second wave, and also a vaccine may well be developed out of the virus as it mutates. This is the sort of story one's hearing.
Patrick, you mentioned the second wave. I mean, aviation and tourism combined, I think I'm right in saying, is just over 12% of the world economy. My take is a lot of countries, perhaps led by their populations, are going to be fearful of this second wave and are going to continue to restrict travel. This could have an enormous impact on many of the southern European countries, heavily dependent on a summer tourism trade. A lot of developing countries dependent on a tourism trade. What do you think of that? Do you think that fear of a second wave could actually keep a lot of economies and obviously the tourism trade running in second gear?
Well, it's obviously possible. The big thing really is whether people will fear a second wave or kind of assume that a second wave can be contained until there's trouble. I mean, human nature tends to be optimistic and hope for the best. And once the first wave has died down and the death rate has dropped to pretty much zero, people will, I think, be more willing to take risks. And then I think they will wait and see about a second wave. I mean, we know that flu comes back in waves every year, but it's usually not that damaging to us. We handle it. We live with it. It coexists with us because the virus essentially has in its own interests that it doesn't kill us, so it can coexist. And then it will come back, again the following year and so on. So I think that it's certainly a reasonable possibility, if not a probability, that people will not act ahead of a second wave, but will kind of expect governments and behavior to react when and if it comes.
Patrick, you're striking quite a hopeful tone, which is good. But do you think that some of the damage could have been done? We've heard that many pubs and restaurants, for example, may well never reopen. It will be unsustainable for them to reopen, given social distancing still being in place. We've heard that companies may use this as an opportunity to start to make people redundant, especially once these schemes start to get wound down. This furlough scheme, for one. What do you think of that? Do you think some of the damage may have already been done?
Well, it's possible that some pubs won't reopen, of course, but the structures will all be there, and if the demand comes back, they'll reopen. I don't think if the people lose their jobs in that sector, and there may be fine jobs in other sectors, the economy is fairly fluid. It can come back into shape. I mean, if people's habits change, the economy will react. People will come back into those industries. It's not as if there's enormous cost in moving in and out of those jobs. They are jobs that people can take and lose and get into other jobs quite easily. So I don't think the economy is going to suffer too much from the sort of back and flow from this virus. I think that there will be sustained changes. It may well be that people will not quite travel so much in general. There may well be more distance communication, rather than, because people will have learned from all this that they can do that. On the other hand, people like going to offices, and it certainly is a strain, as I was saying at the beginning when we were talking about the effects of all this lockdown. It's a strain not seeing colleagues. Maybe we'll see less of them, but we still want to see them. Otherwise, it's very hard to do things, particularly in education and most lines of activity, without seeing people and seeing colleagues and clients. That aspect is necessary, at least for part of the time. So I don't think that life will change totally in pattern. I think what will happen will be that we've had a terrible scare, and we will gradually get used to living with it.
And obviously, having a flexible economy will be key to that. And that leads us quite on well, I think, onto Brexit, which obviously is the principal reason we're interviewing you today. Now, Patrick, obviously, right now the UK is in this transition period with the European Union due to end at the end of the year. During this time, the UK remains in the single market and the customs union. The negotiations are being led by David Frost on the UK side and by Michel Barnier on the EU side. What has been your take of how those negotiations have been progressing? We've heard lots of reports in the press of disagreements. How would you characterize those negotiations at the moment?
Well, the EU have once again tried their luck. They don't really want us to leave. And they still think there's a hope, and they have still thought there was a hope that with the Remainer contingent in the UK opting for soft Brexit and sort of Brexit in name only, they could pressurize us into kind of effectively staying for as long as possible, staying under EU rule. And so they have proposed these ludicrous ideas that we should abandon having independent laws of our own and remain under EU rule giving for another year. And then, of course, they're saying in the agreement that we should effectively adopt this permanently, by having this so-called level playing field conditions. These, they must know, are a big try-on. And it's been made clear by Boris Johnson that this is not on. We didn't go for Brexit in order to continue to be ruled by Brussels indefinitely under the agreement, whereby we don't really leave. And so I think that the EU has tried this hardball approach, hoping that British politics would deliver, particularly now with the crisis generally, thinking the pain of the crisis would mean that the government would sort of lose its nerve and cave in because of supposed damage it would do. So I think Mr. Barnier has basically been trying it on. And from our point of view, it really makes no sense not to leave at the end of December and get out of the EU's laws, regulation and trading arrangements. We need to leave because then we can get on with trading with the rest of the world, free trade agreements with the US, Australia, New Zealand, and Asia Pacific countries that are important to us. And then we can, of course, either trade with the EU under WTO rules, which means that we'll put tariffs mutually on because these are the MFN tariffs we have to levy, have a free trade agreement with. We've announced our tariffs, and what will happen if there are tariffs is that actually we will gain, because when we make these free trade agreements, world prices will prevail in the UK market, and the EU will have to match them. And so any tariffs we put on EU exporters, they'll have to absorb them into their margins so that they don't change their prices here. And so effectively, we would be levying tariffs on them. And any tariffs they levy on us, they can't affect our exporters, because our exporters will keep their prices at world prices where they can sell at the moment once we've done these trade agreements all around the world and here. And so they won't lower their prices. And so EU consumers will have to absorb higher prices from our exporters. But they'll still be cheaper, our prices, than what they're paying for EU output, because EU output's more heavily protected because of all these non-tariff barriers that they levy on the rest of the world, which we can get away from. So effectively, if we trade with the EU under WTO rules, there's absolutely no problem for us at all. And it allows us to go ahead with our trade agreements with the rest of the world. And this is a key point, which I think Boris Johnson's government has absorbed. And Liz Truss is busy going off and negotiating all these free trade agreements. And then, of course, you get to regulation, which is a no-brainer. I mean, we want to get back our regulations, and we want to be able to help those sectors that need help, so that we don't want to be impeded by EU state aid rules, which are very arbitrary. And also they interfere with our virus, bailouts as well. So all these things are really important to us. But then the real knockout is that if we don't leave at the end of December, we get embroiled in the EU's own coronavirus crisis, which is, of course, very dangerous for them. I mean, it's causing mayhem in terms of their decision making, because they can't really decide what to do in terms of solidarity and the cost that involves to the northern countries in helping the southern countries. All that is going on in the EU. And of course, if we stay in there, we're a sitting duck to contribute to all this, because we won't have a voice. And there's all sorts of ways they can bend the rules to make us contribute to their own crisis. So it really is a no-brainer to stay in, to leave at the end of December and not to stay in.
Now, Patrick, I'd like to speak more about the state of the EU after the crisis. But before I do, you mentioned trade and Liz Truss. Now, obviously, Liz Truss is leading the UK side in current negotiation with the US. Robert Lighthizer leading things on the US side. So my question is really twofold. One, what are your hopes for that specific dialogue and that a future trade agreement with the United States? Secondly, there will be people listening to us, Patrick, who say, well, the UK is moving away from this 500 million strong market on its border. There's no way that these trade agreements with the US or with the Commonwealth countries or with Japan could ever compensate for the losses from the EU. But what would you say to that? The potential for the US agreement on the one hand, and how and if it would compensate for any losses we may see from Brexit?
Well, this has been a long-running debate, and the fact is that people on the sort of side of the debate who are saying the EU trade's so important to us have really not come to terms with the UK's trade facts, which are that we are tremendously involved with the rest of the world. And the EU's trade policies have put up our prices from the rest of the world and reduced our availability from the rest of the world massively. And by striking free trade agreements, particularly with the US, which is such an enormous supplier, we bring down our prices on our trade and our traded goods generally, so creating competition in the UK economy with the rest of the world and bringing a benefit to our consumers. And these benefits are huge because the protection the EU has levied has been of the order of 20% on food and manufactures, which has meant that our prices on food and manufactures are a fifth higher than they should be, with corresponding lack of competition and productivity in those industries. And so the significance of these trade agreements with the rest of the world is much bigger than these sort of EU lobby would understand. Yeah, and so we calculate that the gains from doing all these free trade agreements with the rest of the world would boost our GDP by 4%, or even more. That's depending on how much we manage to bring down the protection. If we manage to bring down the protection by the full whack that the EU has put on, it could be double that. So these are huge gains. And as far as the EU trade is concerned, as I was saying just now about WTO rules, under WTO rules, we would put tariffs on. Non-tariff barriers like discrimination on standards and having sort of, sticky borders are illegal under WTO rules. So the only thing that comes in there is tariffs. And those tariffs, according to our calculations, really have no impact on the volume of trade. What happens is that tariffs are paid, our tariffs are paid by EU exporters, and our tariffs are paid by EU consumers. But they still wind up buying the same from us, and we still wind up buying the same from them. It's just the margins. They're paying more in their home currency, and we're paying, when we are getting tariff revenue from EU exporters, but they will still, the volumes actually won't be much different according to our calculations. And so all these sort of fears about EU trade are completely unfounded, whereas the gains from these trade agreements with the rest of the world are absolutely crucial to the progress of our economy as we move into the next decade.
And of course, Patrick, as we move into the next decade, the UK was obviously reinventing itself after Brexit, may well have to reinvent itself as the whole world may have to after the coronavirus crisis. You obviously mentioned some of the, we've talked about potential consequences, and there could be some positive changes as well, such as more home working. So let's delve a bit deeper into the state of the EU and the Eurozone at the moment. I mentioned that the Southern European countries may suffer from a drop in the summer tourism trade. If they're looking to Germany to help, that may be an issue. Germany is likely to continue to suffer from a continued diminished demand for cars. We're seeing diminished demand for in the aerospace sector. Let's talk a little bit more about that. What do you see as the situation right now in the EU and the Eurozone?
Well, there's a very serious crisis in the EU and the Eurozone because the southern economies have been hit very hard and have had a very difficult time. And have had no ability really to respond in the way that we have, because we've got our own currency and our own freedom to use fiscal policy. But Italy, Spain, and Portugal are under restrictions from EU rules on their fiscal policy. And of course, they don't control monetary policy. And what's happening is that the German Constitutional Court, have put a big if over monetary policy, which up to now was buying the government bonds of Spain, Italy, and Portugal in the open market as part of their quantitative easing program. But there's great doubts as to whether that can continue now after the Karlsruhe Court judgment. And also, of course, these countries anyway are very worried about how they can manage the debts that they will be running as a result of the crisis, and are asking for help from the northern countries that are richer and more, should show solidarity with them, they feel. And so there's this great dispute going on as to who will pay for the bailouts in the south of Europe. And how will they be paid for, or will they be possible on the scale needed? And we just don't know how that will resolve itself. It could resolve itself in one or two ways. Either Germany and France and the northern countries shoulder the burden of the south, and they go for much more integration, or they disintegrate, and Italy says, well, look, we want our own currency and our own fiscal policy so we can respond to this bailout needs in our own way, with our own independent fiscal and monetary policy. As you know, opinion in Italy is very finely divided now about the merits of being in the EU, given all this crisis. So I think either way, it's pretty bad for us to stay in this EU, because either way, if they go the integrated route, we are on the hook for an awful lot of money as part of the bailouts in the south. And also, we're part of a bloc that's increasingly federal. And of course, if it disintegrates, again, it would be a big problem for us being in there, because, there will still be demands for bailout. There will be acute crisis in the EU. If Italy were to leave, it's almost impossible to forecast how much damage there would be to the Eurozone. It would create tremendous domino effects in other countries, with a great crisis of confidence in the EU and the Eurozone, with unknowable effects, really, which we really don't want to be involved in.
I mean, Patrick, we've heard that the French and the Germans have now, having had actually a budget dispute even before this coronavirus crisis kicked off, We've had the Corona bonds disagreement. You mentioned the judgment of the German Constitutional Court. Now there's a Franco-German proposed bailout fund. I think it's 500 billion euros in the form of grants. And of course, the Austrians have already suggested this would be anathema to them. They would prefer loans. Clearly, you think sovereign debt crises are possible in the Eurozone. So is this bailout fund too little too late?
Well, basically, it is too little too late, but more to the point, it's not clear it's going to be flying anyway. You know, it takes us back to, if it flies, it means there's a federal Europe, and if it doesn't fly, there's a disintegrating Europe. Either way, it looks pretty bad.
And what do you think of the possibility of a federal Europe? I've said already that a lot of Euro federalists will look at this crisis, and we saw earlier on in this crisis banning of medical exports. The EU's torn up a lot of its own rule book, and I can imagine a lot of Euro federalists saying, "Well, look, if it's because national politicians had to respond to national electorates, wouldn't it be easier if we had one European electorate and there were just pan-European politicians?" Do you think this crisis will be used by the federalists in Brussels, push for full integration, more integration?
Well, I think so, and I think it already is. You see, this fund we were just talking about, which has been proposed by Macron and Merkel, is indeed a federalist fund. It's basically saying they will give money and they will back it with bonds that will be issued in the name of the whole of Europe, which will be backed up by all the countries of Europe. And of course, as you said, Austria and the other smaller countries of the north, like the Netherlands, are thoroughly opposed to this because they can see that they will have to pay a lot of money that they don't really want to pay and can't afford. So I think already it's being used. I mean, it looks as if Merkel has become a federalist overnight. And Macron, we know, has always been a federalist. So it looks like Merkel is pushing for a federal solution and is gambling that German opinion will agree to it, and so resolve the tension, you know, of the German opposition to the so-called transfer union in the euro. And so I think there's a big push for federalism now, essentially because they've come to the conclusion that if they don't push for it now, Macron, Merkel, and the federalists have thought, I think if they don't push for it now, they're not only letting an opportunity for federalism go to waste, if you like, but they're also risking disintegration.
Yeah.
And of course, Germany, there's this tension in Germany between enormous support for the EU and enormous antagonism to the idea of spending any money on it.
Yeah, it's true.
But the thing is, faced with the possibility that it would completely disintegrate, it may well be that German public opinion will come round to the idea that they'd better pay for it.
And Patrick, if that happens, the question really, it's put crudely, is will it succeed? I've often characterized the EU and the Eurozone as a union or a currency union without a demos. I know you're very wary of the UK's involvement. Do you think the federal movement, the move to full-blown integration, do you think, considering the divisions already existent between Southern and Northern Europe, and let's not even get started on the long-standing divisions between Eastern and Central Europe on the one hand and Western Europe on the other, do you think federalism could succeed?
Well, it really does depend on Germany. If Germany is willing to bully the smaller countries and to say it'll pay the bill, then it could succeed. I mean, I think it's as simple as that. Germany is the dominant economy and is the main payer of the bills of the EU. So if it has a change of heart, it could obviously pay for it. I mean, it's a bit like if you go back in history, the British Empire, the UK had to pay large bills for safeguarding the British Empire. And the British currency union, of course, with the British Empire. You know, it was a sterling area, and the Commonwealth. You know, the whole of the British Empire was a sterling area. But of course, these empires come with big costs, and you have to be willing to pay at crucial moments. And frankly, the EU is quite plainly a German-dominated area in which Germany is the dominant economy and the only one that really has the economic strength to sustain it. So if opinion in Germany is that they need to pay the bill, and that federalism is the only way of ensuring the future of Europe, suppose they come to that view, then I think Germany will get its way, you know, if that's what it wants, because it can pay for it. It'll get its way by paying for it, essentially.
Now, Patrick, tying together everything we've discussed today, the coronavirus issue, your thoughts on the economic consequences of that, Brexit, the potential trade deals, reasons why the transition shouldn't be delayed, and of course, the state of the EU. If you had one major prediction or forecast for the next 6 to 9 months, could be domestically, could be internationally, what would that prediction or forecast be?
Well, I'm basically reasonably optimistic that the coronavirus crisis will pass, and there will be quite a strong recovery in the second half of this year. And that's based on really my feelings that popular sentiment will react against the sort of, we must kind of stay indoors because we're frightened of going out of doors, as the deaths from this wave of coronavirus infection die down. And so that's the key kind of short to medium term view that I've got. And then the other point I'd make is I think we will definitely leave the EU at the end of this year, because the risks of staying in and the damage to us from staying in are just too great. I mean, it really is, I think, a complete no-brainer. And I don't think the government has any doubt about that. And if it may well be that the EU will not come round to having a trade agreement by then, but I think that's unlikely too, because given the turmoil in the EU, to have additional tariffs to pay and trouble with their trade with Britain in terms of its profitability will not look like a good idea on top of all the problems they've already got. And so I think they will do a deal at the last minute. And we will get a trade agreement with the EU, which will be a common sense trade agreement, basically of no change. And yes, of course, we will agree to have some agreement on fish. We've already said we would come to some agreement on fish, like Norway does, allowing, EU fishermen access to British waters, provided they're our waters, and we can, renegotiate that as we decide. And also, of course, we will say, as we have already said, that we're not planning to suddenly move to a sort of completely free-for-all economy with no environmental controls or, labor market laws, which they say they need the level playing field for. We've said we have no intention of doing that, but we are obviously going to be in charge of our own regulations and evolve them as seems fit for us. So I think we will have an agreement with the EU at the end of the day, because we will be able to give them some assurances, in the short to medium term about fish and the environment and, level playing field type things. But we will leave and they will agree, and we will in the end have a sensible free trade agreement with the EU. Makes sense all round.
Patrick, that seems like a good positive note on which to end. So thank you very much for your time today. It's very much appreciated.
My pleasure. Good to
talk. My thanks to Professor Patrick Minford, and thank you for watching. If you'd like to find out more, you can visit www.brexit-watch.org. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter. Until next time.